Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy, Roll Good, and today we're going to continue the Unearthed Arcana for the horror-themed subclasses. Today we're looking at the Phantom Rogue and the Shadow Sorcerer. Originally we recovered the two new subclasses, the Reanimator Artificer as well as the Hollow Warden Ranger. Both of those looked very cool. If you want to go ahead and see what I think about that one, you can go back to that video and watch it maybe after this one. We've also covered the two Warlock subclass revisions, that being the Undead Patron Warlock as well as the new revised Hexblade Patron Warlock, and kind of all the interesting things that are going on with that particular subclass as well. But today is about some more fan favorites, I think that being the Phantom Rogue as well as the Shadow Sorcerer. I know the Shadow Sorcerer is very popular. Phantom Rogue at least is one of my favorites as far as the Rogue subclasses go, so I was excited to see what they're doing with this one, so let's just go ahead and jump right into it, starting with the Phantom Rogue. So starting with the intro text for the subclass, it says, "Embrace death and wield ghostly power. Some rogues walk the veil between life and death, shepherding opponents to the grave and slipping through the world as an undetectable spirit. In these pursuits, a rogue might discover a mystical connection to death itself. Such an individual becomes immersed in negative energy, infusing their strikes with deathly energy and stealing knowledge from the souls who have passed on. Thieves' guilds value rogues of this persuasion as highly effective information gatherers and spies." When I first thought that they were doing a revision to the Phantom Rogue, I was a little nervous about it because, again, this is one of my favorite rogue subclasses just based on the way that works and kind of the way that everything feeds into each other, so I was hoping they weren't going to change too much of it. But as we can see by this description, it's still very much on par with what is on the left side of it in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. Much like we've seen with many other subclass descriptions, they removed a lot of the proper nouns like the Shadowfell, Eberron, very specific references to very specific places. This way you can basically just drop that subclass into any setting and kind of make your connections to whichever fits that setting the best. I mean, you could technically always do that, but they're just kind of intentionally leaving specific references out. So far everything kind of checks out. Let's go ahead and look at the actual features, starting with Whispers of the Dead. So in the Unearthed Arcana, it says, whenever you finish a short or long rest, you can choose one skill or tool proficiency that you lack and gain it, as a ghostly presence shares its knowledge with you. You lose this proficiency when you use this benefit again to choose a different proficiency. So this feature is basically unchanged. You can see that I've highlighted nothing here. What I find a little interesting about it, based on some changes that we've seen that they make in other 2024 classes, including the Rogue, the base Rogue, is that you still maintain the ability to gain a tool proficiency. The base Rogue can no longer get expertise in Thieves' tools, for example. There's, mechanical reasons for that. But even when we saw the Unearthed Arcana for the Artificer, which is supposed to be the subclass that's all about tools, they removed some tool expertise and something from them as well. So it's nice to see that at least tool proficiency is still intact here on this subclass. This one's basically unchanged. Let's go look at the actual sort of engine of the subclass, and that being Wails from the Grave. In the Unearthed Arcana, it says, immediately after you deal your sneak attack damage to a creature on your turn, you can target a second creature that you can see within 30 feet of the first creature. Roll half the number of sneak attack dice for your level rounded up, and the second creature takes necrotic damage equal to the roll's total as the wails of the dead momentarily sound around them. You can use this feature a number of times equal to your dexterity modifier, minimum of once, and you regain all expended uses when you finish a long rest. The only real change here is that this is now limited by your dexterity modifier, which again is very, very common in 2024 features. And as I mentioned, pretty much anytime this comes up, is that you'll usually have a little more or the same number of uses early on or sort of in the middle of the game, but then by the time you get to level 17, and that's assuming that you are investing in that primary ability as you normally would as a rogue, by level 17 you'll have less uses than you normally would because your proficiency bonus goes up to 6. You only have a +5 to your dexterity modifier, so at that point, until you get your dexterity to 22 or higher, you will technically have less uses. But generally early on and in the middle of the game, you won't really notice the difference. And even with the way that the subclass works, I don't think that you'll really know the difference anyway, unless you're basically in one big single target fight and you're trying to burn as many of these as possible. One other cool thing in 2024 with the Rogue's Cunning Strike feature is that it is not hampered by the Cunning Strike feature. So when you use the Cunning Strike for a rogue, you sacrifice a number of your sneak attack die that you would normally roll to do an additional effect with that sneak attack. However, the text here says roll half the number of sneak attack dice for your level rounded up. It is not half the number of sneak attack dice that you rolled, it is half the number for your level. So even if you sacrifice one or more of your sneak attack dice for a cunning action, that does not affect the number of sneak attack dice that you roll for Wails from the Grave. So that's kind of a really cool sort of interaction. Even if you were to somehow dump all of your sneak attack dice to do a cunning action on your main sneak attack, you'd still be able to do damage to this off target by doing half the number of sneak attack dice for your level. That's actually pretty cool. I like that a lot. So then let's go ahead and jump to the level 9 feature. We have Tokens of the Departed. This one I think is almost just as important as Wails from the Grave. It kind of works together with Wails from the Grave. As much as I love this subclass for rogues, I hate rogue subclasses in general because they have to wait so long for their second subclass feature. Again, many adventures don't even go to 9th level. Some of them end, at 9th or 10th or 11th level. Some of them maybe go as high as 14. Usually, like, by the time you get this, you don't have a lot of time to play with it. So just one reason I don't like the way that rogue subclass features are so far spread apart in the early levels. But for Tokens of the Departed in the Unearthed Arcana, it says whenever you finish a long rest, you gain 2 soul trinkets. Each soul trinket is a tiny object. The DM determines the trinket's form or has you roll on the trinkets table in the player's handbook to generate it. These trinkets last until you finish another long rest, at which point they disintegrate. If you ever move more than 30 feet from a trinket, the trinket immediately teleports to you, appearing somewhere on your person. The number of soul trinkets you gain when you finish a long rest increases when you reach rogue levels 13, at which point you get 3 trinkets, and then level 17 you get 4 trinkets. So in order to use these soul trinkets, you can use these soul trinkets in the following ways. The first one is called Death's Knell. When you deal sneak attack damage on your turn, you can expend 1 soul trinket and immediately use Wails from the Grave without expending a use of that feature. The expended trinket is then destroyed. There's also another one called Life Essence. This one says, while you have at least 1 soul trinket, you have advantage on death saving throws and constitution saving throws. And then finally, you have Spirit Query. You can take a magic action to expend 1 soul trinket and immediately cast the Augury spell, requiring no spell components and using dexterity as the spellcasting modifier. The expended trinket is destroyed. Finally, you have Regaining soul trinkets. When a creature you can see within 30 feet of you dies, you can take a reaction to regain 1 expended soul trinket. So the big changes from the current version of the Phantom Rogue is that you now start with 2 soul trinkets. Previously, you didn't start with any of them, and you had to actually get into combat and have a creature die and then use your reaction to grab their soul and sort of farm them that way. So instead of having to worry about that sort of logistics, you at least start with 2, and that is the max number that you can have, because when you regain soul trinkets, you are regaining an expended soul trinket. So you start with 2, and that's as many as you can have at once. Then you get up to 3 at level 13 and then 4 at level 17. That sort of feedback loop is basically the same as it was. Another small change here in the number of soul trinkets that you can have is that it was previously limited to your proficiency bonus, and you couldn't have more than your proficiency bonus. So you are getting less now with 2, 3, and 4 as opposed to 2 through 6. However, you do get them immediately after a long rest, so I think that's a fair trade-off, especially since you're probably going to be getting into combat anyways, so you'll be fishing these back pretty regularly. The next change here is that they now last until you finish another long rest, at which point they disintegrate, and then of course you would immediately regain 2 or whatever the number of soul trinkets that you can get after a long rest are. This is basically just a cleanup step. They're just making sure that you can't carry over soul trinkets from the previous day to the next day. The fact that they teleport immediately to you if you're ever more than 30 feet away from you, I'm sure this will never result in a rogue trying to swindle a vendor by trying to convince them that it's some mystical artifact that they can sell for a high price, and then they walk away and then it immediately teleports back to them. I'm sure that will never happen. That's not a very rogue thing to do at all, but it is just something that this can currently do. I do like that the Death's Knell feature was retained. That's probably going to be the main use of it, especially for combat reasons. Maybe you want to always hold on to one of them so that you always have advantage on death saving throws or constitution saving throws. Spirit Query used to allow you to use your action. Of course, it now uses a magic action in 2024. No big surprises there, but it used to allow you to ask the soul in that trinket 1 question. And of course, it could only provide an answer that it could reasonably know in life. It was under no compulsions to tell the truth or anything like that. So they kind of cleaned up all that kind of wishy-washiness and just made it the Augury spell. If you're not familiar with how Augury works, it's basically you just get a vibe from the DM. So here's what the Augury spell looks like. You receive an omen from an otherworldly entity about the results of a course of action that you plan to take within the next 30 minutes. So your team is going around trying to get into a dungeon. They're not quite sure if their plan is going to work out. You're basically going to shake your magic 8-ball of your soul trinket and be like, hey, is this going to go well, or what do we think is going to happen here? And the DM can give you one of 4 options, being wheel for good, woe for bad, wheel and woe for both good and bad, or just indifferent where it's neither good nor bad. So not super specific, but I mean it is. I think it's overall just cleaner, easier for the DM to adjudicate on the fly without having to remember who that soul trinket belonged to, what they knew, that sort of thing. So it is really this feature and the Wails of the Dead itself that I really just like this feedback loop within the subclass. I think it's just so cool. I'm glad that this is still intact and basically just as good as it was. Let's go ahead and move on to the next level 9 feature, which is Voice of Death. They actually didn't have a second level 9 feature previously, so this is brand new. It says you can cast Speak with Dead once without a spell slot, requiring no spell components, and using dexterity as the spellcasting ability for it. You regain the ability to cast it this way when you finish a short or long rest. So that's actually pretty cool. I mean, it does seem like something that the Phantom Rogue would be able to do, and maybe maybe the old sort of, what was the previous one called? The spirit query, the old version of that. Maybe that was supposed to take place of that. But now that they can actually speak with dead, I think that kind of is a good trade-off as well for losing the ability to ask direct questions to a past soul. So now you get the benefit of getting a vibe from the DM with augury, and you can now actually speak with dead when you find a dead creature and you want to kind of get a sense of maybe what's ahead if you just killed them in the dungeon and you're trying to get an answer out of them, or if it's like a murder mystery and you're doing things like that. You know, all sorts of situations that this spell could come up in. This is a very good spell to kind of have in your pocket. So this is just a very nice feature overall. Moving on to the next subclass feature, we have the level 13 Ghost Walk. In the Unearthed Arcana, it says, as a bonus action, you assume a spectral form, gaining the benefits below for 10 minutes or until you end them with no action required. Once you use this feature, you can't use it again until you finish a long rest, unless you expend and destroy one of your soul trinkets from tokens of the departed, no action required, to restore your use of it. First, you get flight. You gain a fly speed of 10 feet and can hover. You have hazy form. Attack rolls against you have disadvantage. And then you have incorporeal movement. You can move through occupied spaces as though they were difficult terrain. If you end your turn in such a space, you take 1d10 force damage. So there's two very similar timing changes in here. One, it no longer requires any sort of action economy to end the effect. Two, it no longer requires any sort of action economy to restore your use of it. It technically never required any action economy to restore your use of it because you could just do it as part of the bonus action that you take to activate it. But now they kind of separated that, so it's no longer the exact same thing, but it's the exact same effect either way. The only other change here is that the incorporeal movement now says that you can move through occupied spaces. Previously it said that you can move through creatures and objects as if they were difficult terrain. I don't know if they're just making this a little more specific to actual rules in the game, such as what is an occupied space, that sort of thing, or if they're just trying to say that, hey, you can't end your space inside someone and then sort of recorporate and make them explode or do something like the Ant-Man Thanos sort of thing, but with like a ghost. So they're saying you can't do that, but you can move through an occupied space. You're not technically just like moving through the actual creature. So again, nothing too crazy here. Again, just mainly just modernizing the text of it, kind of cleaning up some language, working on some better formatting. So let's go ahead and then move on to the capstone for the Phantom Rogue. This one is called Death's Friend. It says your association with death has become so close that you gain the following benefits. First, you get Death's Lament. So you become best friends with death, but then the first feature is called Death's Lament. Like, it's like, oh man, this guy. When you use your Wails from the Grave feature, you can deal the necrotic damage to both the first and the second creature. And then secondly, you get Draw of Death. It says when you roll initiative, you regain one soul trinket for your tokens of the departed if you have none remaining. So the only real change here is that the Draw of Death now regains you a soul token when you roll initiative if you have none remaining. Currently, this gives you one soul token at the end of a long rest, but now that we automatically get a number of soul trinkets after a long rest, that's no longer relevant. So now we get one when we roll initiative, assuming that we have none left. I guess my only little complaint about it is that I don't know how much I like the requiring you to be empty on your soul trinkets in order to gain the benefit of the Draw of Death feature. They have something similar for the Bard as one of their higher level class features, that when they roll initiative, they gain up to 2 of their bardic inspirations back, assuming that they have less than 2. Maybe I would like to see something like that here as well, where we're not sort of incentivized to empty the tank before combat to make use of this feature. But that's just really a small suggestion. Overall, this is still well designed. So the final question we would ask ourselves is the Unearthed Arcana Phantom Rogue any good? And I would say, if anything, it's certainly better. It's not a lot better. In some ways you can consider a lot of the changes very, very small nerfs, but I think overall this is a net positive. There's just mostly a number of very small quality of life changes. My only suggestion would be to change that capstone, the Draw of Death that we just talked about, to say that you get up to 2 soul trinkets back when you roll initiative, assuming that you have less than 2, just so it doesn't feel like we're incentivized to spend them all the time, to make sure that we enter initiative without them to gain the benefit of that. It's your subclass capstone. It should be a little more powerful than everything else. So that's the Phantom Rogue. Let's go ahead and jump on to the next subclass we're looking at in this video, which is the Shadow Sorcery Sorcerer. So looking at the intro text, you bend darkness and doom to your will. Your innate magic comes from the Shadowfell itself. You might trace your lineage to an entity from that place, or perhaps you were exposed to the Shadowfell's sinister energy and were transformed by it. Your shadowy magic allows you to command darkness, undeath, and woe with ease. So this was actually the first one that surprised me, because where every other intro text removed all references to specific places and other proper nouns, this one still mentions the Shadowfell multiple times. I don't know if that was an accident or if they just felt that they couldn't explain where you get your shadowy powers anywhere else. I don't know if Shadowfell is Forgotten Realms only, or if it's sort of like a part of a multiverse between that and Greyhawk or whatever. But I just thought that was interesting. Let's go ahead and move on to the actual features of the Sorcerer. Moving on to Eyes of the Dark. Of course, the big change to all Sorcerer subclasses in 2024 is that you get your subclass at 3rd level as opposed to your 1st level now. So that's the one big change. That, of course, is happening to all Sorcerer subclasses. That is not a feature of this Unearthed Arcana. But for Eyes of the Dark here, it says you have dark vision within a range of 120 feet and blind sight within a range of 10 feet. feet. In addition, if a spell you cast creates an area of darkness, you can see normally through that spell's darkness. So this always gave us the 120 feet of dark vision, but it now also gains this blind sight to 10 feet, which is kind of cool. You know, blind sight is maybe the most common tertiary sense that we get in class features, but it is still very rare that you get it. So it's nice to see it here. But the biggest buff to this one is the second paragraph where it says, if you cast a spell that creates an area of darkness, you can see normally through that spell's darkness. Previously, this gave you the spell darkness. It also required you to cast a spell by spending 2 sorcery points instead of a spell slot in order to get the ability to see through that magical darkness. Now it's just whenever you cast a spell that creates an area of darkness, you can see normally through it. So when I was initially putting this slide together, I was like, this probably tells me that there's going to be a subclass spell list, and I bet that subclass spell list is at least going to contain darkness as well as Hunger of Hadar, because Hunger of Hadar also now technically creates darkness in 2024, whereas that wasn't clearly explicit before. And it turned out that I was correct, that you do have a shadow spells list here. This is completely new for the Shadow Sorcerer in 2024, so this is very cool. It's good to have these sort of subclass spell lists whenever we can. So at Sorcerer level 3, you would get access to Bane, Darkness, Inflict Wounds, and Pass Without Trace. Again, these are always prepared for you as a Sorcerer. At Sorcerer level 5, you would get Hunger of Hadar and Summon Undead. At level 7, you get Greater Invisibility and Phantasmal Force. Level 9, you get Contagion and Creation. Overall, this is a pretty stacked spell list. Pass Without Trace is pretty good. I think you got Pass Without Trace as part of the base Shadow Sorcerer before. I could be wrong about that. I'd have to double check. The only one that really stands out here is Creation. I don't know what that has to do with Shadow Sorcery, but you know, I'm not going to complain about any of these spells being on this spell list. I feel like I've been saying this about a lot of the spell lists that I've been seeing lately, and maybe that's just a boon to the 2024 changes, that this is a pretty stacked spell list, maybe one of the better ones that we've seen. Well, I think I've explained this before in one of my older videos. I do want to reiterate that only the Darkness spell blocks dark vision. Not all magical darkness blocks dark vision. It only blocks dark vision if it says it does. If you look at the Darkness spell, you can see that text here. It does say dark vision can't see through it. In some other like published adventure modules from Wizards of the Coast, it'll say things like, oh, this area is covered in magical darkness and dark vision can't see through it. So unless it says that dark vision can't see through it, it doesn't matter if it's magical darkness, you can still see into it with dark vision. And that is important for Hunger of Hadar, because Hunger of Hadar does create darkness, but it does not create darkness that dark vision can't penetrate. However, it does separately impose the blinded condition as per that last sentence in the first paragraph there. There's no light, magical, or otherwise can illuminate the area, and creatures fully within it have the blinded condition. So creatures within the Hunger of Hadar, even if they have dark vision, they are still blinded by the effect of the spell, and they can't see out of it. But if you have allies who are outside the Hunger of Hadar, they can see creatures into it, assuming that they have dark vision. You as the sorcerer, since it is your spell and you cast it presumably, you can see into it normally with no penalties. People with dark vision, of course, see into it with dim light, which I believe imposes disadvantage on perception checks, as well as they can only see in shades of gray. So there's a bit of nuance there, but I just think it's worth pointing out when these sort of things come up. So then moving on to the next feature, we're looking at Strength of the Grave. So this one is actually missing from the Unearthed Arcana. So we can look at this one. It says your existence in a twilight state between life and death makes you difficult to defeat. When damage reduces you to 0 hit points, you can make a charisma saving throw, DC 5 plus the damage taken. On a success, you instead drop to 1 hit point. You can't use this feature if you are reduced to 0 hit points by radiant damage or a critical hit. After the saving throw succeeds, you can't use this feature again until you finish a long rest. So when I was putting this slide together, I was like, this one feels like it's pretty strange that they would just straight up remove this feature and not put it in one of these earlier features. So my assumption when I created this slide was that this probably exists in a later feature, but we would have to wait and see. So then let's go ahead and jump to the next subclass here, to level 6. We have the Hound and or Spirits of Ill Omen. So this is called Hound of Ill Omen currently. In the Unearthed Arcana, it's called Spirits of Ill Omen. It works kind of entirely different, but maybe a little bit the same. We'll talk about that. It says you can cast Summon Undead without a material component. You can also cast it once without a spell slot, and you regain the ability to cast it this way when you finish a long rest. Whenever you start casting the spell, you can modify it so that it doesn't require concentration. If you do so, that spell's duration becomes 1 minute for that casting, and the spell ends early if you cast it again. My first reaction to this was, oh no, they killed the dog. And then the fact that they were replacing it with just like, oh, you get another one of these summon features like we've seen with like the Draconic Sorcerer or the Illusionist Wizard. I was like, come on, they're not doing this again. It was cute the first time with the Draconic Sorcerer and the Illusionist Wizard. You know, maybe every class gets one subclass that has like a companion subclass, something like that. So my immediate feeling to this was like, man, this feels like a cheap cop-out. You know, sure, the Hound of Ill Omen takes up a lot of text on the page. Maybe they're just trying to like save money by having to print less. But I was like, okay, hold on, let's calm down and let's just make some comparisons to see how similar similar are these two features in practice? So first, if we're talking about casting time, the Hound of Ill Omen is a bonus action, the summon is a whole action. For the cost, the Hound costs 3 sorcery points, whereas the summon is a 3rd level spell slot. If we use the Font of Magic feature from the Sorcerer, that tells us that the 3rd level spell slot would be worth 5 sorcery points if you wanted to buy it back. However, you do get the first cast for free, so that is worth noting. One upside of being able to actually cast this spell is that you can upcast it, and the spell itself does scale with higher upcasting. Typically, every even level is when you'd want to cast it, because that's when it would get an additional multi-attack. If we're looking at the range that you can place this thing, the Hound has a range of 120 feet when you first cast it. The summon has an initial range of 90 feet. However, that's a little deceptive because it does act immediately after your turn. So even though you can summon it only 90 feet away, the summon does take its turn immediately after yours, and it has a speed of 30 to 40 feet depending on which form you chose. That's basically an effective range of 120 to 130 feet depending on which form you chose. As far as the attacks, the Hound can only attack the one target, whereas the summon can actually go after anything. Not only that, but like I mentioned, the attacks will scale with the level of upcasting that you do, so it could potentially attack many more times than the Hound could. We're looking at duration. The Hound disappears if it is reduced to 0, if its target is reduced to 0, or after 5 minutes. The summon disappears only if it's reduced to 0 or after 1 hour if you're concentrating on it, or 1 minute without concentration. Arguably, there's no difference between 5 minutes and 1 minute unless you're going into like back-to-back combats, but usually that's not the case. Usually 5 minutes and 1 minute are effectively the same thing, because it's going to be at least that long before you get into another skirmish. As far as hit points go, the Hound actually gets quite a few more hit points just naturally, as well as getting extra temporary hit points equal to half your sorcerer level. The Shadow Spawn at a 3rd level spell casting gets 30 or 20 hit points depending on the form you cast, plus 10 per spell level higher than 3, so you can certainly upcast it to outscale the Hound, but typically the Shadow Spawn is going to be a little bit squishier than the Hound. But as far as what they can do, both of them can get a form of incorporeal movement, although the summon needs to be in the ghost form to do so. The Hound automatically detects targets if they're hidden, whereas the summon cannot do that. The Hound imposes disadvantage on saving throws against spells the Sorcerer casts. The summon does not have that effect. That is kind of a big one, because that is a very strong effect for the Sorcerer to have the Hound next to that creature, especially since they can do this as a bonus action, so they can summon the Hound next to a creature and then try to do like a hold person or a big saving throw based spell at disadvantage. As for what the summon undead can do itself, the ghost form gets a fly speed. In addition, it also gets the incorporeal movement. It also can frighten a creature when it hits that creature, so there's no saving throw. They just hit the creature with their attack, and that creature is then frightened. The putrid form attempts to poison creatures within 5 feet of it and can paralyze a poisoned creature if they hit them with an attack. That is also a pretty powerful combo. It also has a skeleton form, but the skeleton form is pretty basic. It just has a very long range attack, and it has lower hit points in general. So unless you really just want them to be safe at range, you're probably not going to choose that one. Losing the disadvantage on saving throws does hurt quite a bit, but both I think the ghost and putrid forms of the summon can be pretty powerful in their own right. And notably, the concentration-free casting of this spell isn't limited to just the free casting of it. You can do that anytime you cast that spell, regardless of what level you cast it at. So if you cast an 8th level summon undead, you can make that last a minute concentration free. Although maybe if you're upcasting it that high, maybe you want to be concentrating on it so that you can maybe get more use out of it, since it lasts an hour at that point. So while the Hound is certainly useful in its own right, I think the summon undead is also no slouch, and I think the ceiling on it is higher just because it is a better offensive tool if you upcast it appropriately. And currently, while my instinct is usually to be a little critical of using spells as features, I think one potentially positive thing to say about it is that it does give players a reason to cast all these spells that maybe not everyone looks at. You know, it's very easy to say that the designers are just too lazy and they don't want to design anything new. I think it's also very easy for us to kind of sit back and be like, well, they actually have a bunch of these spells that maybe no one uses all the time, that they can find cool ways to actually incorporate them into the game and make it so that the players can get more use out of them than they maybe normally would. Moving on to the next Shadow Sorcery feature, we have Shadow Walk. In the Unearthed Arcana, it says while you are in dim light or darkness, you can take a bonus action to teleport up to 120 feet to an unoccupied space you can see that is also in dim light or darkness. This one is actually just completely unchanged from the current version. And that brings us to the subclass capstone for the Shadow Sorcerer called Umbral Form. In the Unearthed Arcana, it says as a bonus action, you adopt a shadowy form, getting the benefits below for 1 minute until you have the incapacitated condition or until you end the form, no action required. Once you use this feature, you can't use it again until you finish a long rest, unless you spend 6 sorcery points, no action required, to restore your use of it. The benefits it gives you start with incorporeal movement. You can move through occupied spaces as if they were difficult terrain. If you end your turn in such a space, you take 1d10 force damage. There's also Shadow Resilience. You have resistance to all damage except force and radiant damage. And lastly, Strength of the Grave. That feature that was missing from the 3rd level features is now on the capstone. It says if you would drop to 0 hit points and not die outright, you can make a charisma saving throw, DC 5 plus half the damage taken. If you succeed, your hit points instead change to a number equal to 3 times your sorcerer level. So first things first, ending this form of course requires no action. That is the first first change that we see. That's basically just a quality of life. Secondly, you now get 1 free use of this feature, whereas currently you always had to spend 6 sorcery points to even activate it the first time, but you get 1 for free per long rest. Secondly, you might also notice that on the left side it says the current effect, the way that it currently works in the rules is that the effect ends if you die. That is like technically relevant because if you die outright, you are just dead, and dead imposes no particular conditions on you. Your DM might very much rule that that's absurd, but technically speaking, being dead doesn't impose the unconscious condition, but being at 0 hit points does. If we look in the actual player's handbook, it says when a creature drops to 0 hit points, it either dies outright or falls unconscious as explained below. If we look at falling unconscious, it says if you reach 0 hit points and don't die instantly, you have the unconscious condition until you regain any hit points. There's nothing really here that says when you are dead, you also have the unconscious condition. It is only if you reach 0 hit points and don't die instantly. If you die outright, you're just dead. And there's nothing about dead that says you're incapacitated. So technically dying outright, such as by power word kill, wouldn't end the umbral form. I would not blame a DM for ruling otherwise. This is one of those things that is technically correct. So moving on from that, we have the 1d10 force damage for incorporeal movement. This used to just say 5 force damage. Basically, they just took the average of the 1d10 and made that the number. So they're just making it a roll, which honestly makes a lot more sense with the way that pretty much every other feature works in the game. As for Strength of the Grave, one of the benefits now is that it now changes your hit points to a number equal to 3 times your sorcerer level. So that's going to be, what, like 51 hit points at level 17 up to 60 at level 20. That's certainly enough to maybe take 2 or 3 more hits depending on the creature you're fighting and what CR they are. Additionally, this effect can no longer be bypassed by being reduced to 0 by radiant damage or a critical hit, just when you're dropped to 0 and not killed outright. And also the DC is a bit easier because now it's DC 5 plus half the damage taken, whereas previously it was DC 5 plus the damage taken, so the DC should be much lower to make as well, which can be very useful against creatures that hit very hard. That compounded with the fact that you have Shadow Resilience, so assuming that the damage that you're taking is not force or radiant damage, you're already having that. And then the saving throw is half of that as well. So that's basically like a DC 5 plus a quarter of the damage unless it's force or radiant. That should be a pretty simple DC. That DC doesn't increase if you have to use this feature more than once in an adventuring day. So very powerful changes here as well. So the final question we have to ask ourselves is the Unearthed Arcana Shadow Sorcery any good? I would say both this and the Phantom Rogue are basically both just better. The addition of the subclass spell list is always appreciated. Spirits of Ill Omen does a lot of the same work as the Hound of Ill Omen does. Again, they're not exactly the same thing, but I would say overall they're pretty comparable features, and cat owners can rejoice that they can create, an undead cat instead of a hound when they use this sort of feature. I'd say both of these subclasses get the green light for me, which I would say is pretty rare for Unearthed Arcanas with me. There's always usually something I want to say. Outside of that one small thing on the Phantom Rogue, again, I'm not really mad about anything that's in here. But that's just my opinion. You might think something differently. There might be something that you saw that maybe I didn't point out or didn't see. So let me know what you think about all that down in the comments below. And again, while you're going down to those comments, please hit that like button. If you are a new or returning viewer and you like what you saw here and you want to see more from me, please consider hitting that subscribe button and support the channel. I release videos every Wednesday and Sunday, so you always have something to look forward to. I appreciate your time, and I'll see you in the next one.